Wood, hearing that Harry had no experience with Quidditch, opened the box to show the game balls. "Let me explain the rules first." "No need for such trouble," Sherlock interrupted Wood. "Just get 2 broomsticks." Wood looked to McGonagall, and seeing her nod, he promptly fetched 2 broomsticks. Sherlock handed one to Harry, then jumped onto the other and flew directly into the air, gesturing for Harry to follow. Wood's eyes immediately brightened. As they say, when an expert makes a move, you immediately know if they have skill. As the house team captain, just that one takeoff was enough for him to see many things. Clearly, both young wizards had considerable talent in flying. Maintaining parallel flight with Sherlock in mid-air, Harry asked nervously, "Sherlock, what do we do now?" Sherlock directly pulled something from his pocket and held it up before Harry. "Look." It was a spherical object that glittered in the sunlight. "Neville's Remembrall. How did you get it?" Harry recognized it immediately. "I picked it from him before we went to find Professor McGonagall." Harry looked shocked. "But we were together the whole time. When did you—" "Harry, that's not important," Sherlock interrupted. "Your task now is to not let it hit the ground." "Huh." Harry couldn't understand. The Remembrall was in Sherlock's hand. Why would it fall to the ground? Sherlock didn't explain, just smiled slightly. "Dear Harry, you wouldn't want Neville to be heartbroken over his broken Remembrall, would you?" Harry, W. The moment Sherlock said this, Harry immediately had an ominous premonition. The next moment, "Go!" Sherlock directly threw Neville's Remembrall out. He gave Harry no time to prepare, or rather, that previous sentence had already been his warning to Harry to get ready. Harry hadn't expected Sherlock to do this at all. Fortunately, his body reacted faster than his brain. Almost without thinking, he pointed his broomstick downward and accelerated into a dive toward the ground. Under the combined force of gravity and magic, his speed grew faster and faster, until it seemed he would crash heavily into the ground. Harry could even hear Ron's screams mixed with the howling wind, yet he felt no tension at all. Not only was he not tense, but he was unusually calm, even somewhat excited. Finally, he caught the glass ball at a height of 1 foot from the ground. He pulled the broomstick up just in time, letting it settle gently on the grass, the Remembrall held securely in his palm. He then discovered that Sherlock had somehow returned to the ground as well. Just as he was about to speak, angry shouts came from behind him. "Potter!" McGonagall strode over, the wand in her hand not yet put away, her right palm holding the wand slick with sweat. She had been just moments away from using magic to save him. "In all my years at Hogwarts, I have never—" The familiar words made Sherlock raise an eyebrow. "How dare you? You could have broken your neck." Harry was speechless. He truly didn't know what he should say at such a moment. He felt that anything he said would be wrong. Fortunately, there was Sherlock. "Professor, I think this performance is sufficient to prove Harry's talent." The calm voice formed a sharp contrast with McGonagall's agitation. "Sherlock Holmes." The moment Sherlock spoke, he drew all the fire away from Harry, allowing the latter to breathe a quiet sigh of relief while his gratitude toward Sherlock rose once again. "Making a fellow student do such a thing, you're absolutely reckless. If something had happened to Potter, you would bear full responsibility." "Nothing would happen to him. I believe in him, and even more in you, Professor." "You—" McGonagall was left speechless. "Brilliant. A real natural." Just then, Wood spoke at the perfect moment, interrupting McGonagall's building emotions. "A 50-foot dive to catch that thing cleanly, and he didn't even get a scratch. Even Charlie Weasley couldn't have done that." He practically leaped to Harry's side. Gripping firmly the hand with which Harry held the Remembrall, the obsession and fanaticism in his gaze made McGonagall's mouth twitch. "Professor, listen to me. We must get him a proper broomstick. I say, let's get a Nimbus 2000 or a Clean Sweep 7. No, it has to be a Nimbus 2000. His appearance forced McGonagall to stop being angry at Sherlock. "Wood, Potter is still a first-year student." "That's not a problem." Wood waved his hand domineeringly. "Professor, you must go to Professor Dumbledore and get us permission to use a first-year student. If you don't go, I'll go myself." You know we desperately need a Quidditch team better than last year's. Harry, I welcome you to the Gryffindor House team. As captain, I'm officially notifying you that training starts next week. McGonagall. Watching Wood's self-directed monologue, McGonagall suddenly felt somewhat superfluous. Oliver Wood was indeed an excellent student with good character and academics. But whenever Quidditch was mentioned, he seemed to become a different person. However, she had to admit that Wood was absolutely right. Harry Potter. He really was a natural talent. Potter. Harry immediately turned to McGonagall, adopting an attentive listening posture. I want to hear that you're training hard, or I'll change my mind and punish you. At this moment, Harry could hardly believe what he was hearing. He had actually been promoted exceptionally. It must be kept secret. After all, this is the youngest house team player in a century. You'll be our secret weapon. Just looking at Wood's expression, it was as if he had already won the house cup. Hopefully. Sherlock was non-committal about this. He wasn't optimistic about keeping this matter secret. As for you, Mr. Holmes. Professor McGonagall turned to Sherlock. Harry's performance saved you from losing points and being put in detention, but that doesn't prove your reckless behavior was correct. Sherlock sighed. He had already guessed what she was going to say next. Sure enough, Professor McGonagall seized the opportunity to make her demand. So, I don't want to hear anyone tell me again that you're missing Professor Quirrell's defense against the dark arts classes. Very well, Professor. Sherlock's straightforward agreement somewhat surprised McGonagall, and also disappointed her. She had originally thought this unconventional little fellow would resist a bit more. Of course, Sherlock wouldn't resist. Through Professor McGonagall's words and actions, he had already deduced that she would never compromise on this matter. Since that was the case, there was no need for unnecessary struggles. Having considerable knowledge of psychology, he was well aware that when facing the party in control of the situation, sometimes the more the disadvantaged party struggled, the more excited the other party became. Potter, your father would be proud of you. Seeing that Sherlock's issue was resolved, McGonagall looked at Harry again. He used to be an excellent Quidditch player himself. When she said this, her face broke into a smile. At this moment, Harry was stunned. In all his time at school, he had never seen Professor McGonagall smile so brilliantly. Even when Sherlock and Hermione earned points for Gryffindor in Transfiguration class, she had at most smiled slightly. He hadn't expected her to be so happy about his joining the Quidditch House team. Professor McGonagall really was a good person after all. It would be even better if she assigned less homework normally. The atmosphere was harmonious, and this mission to join the Quidditch House team had achieved a perfect conclusion. Just then, a conflicting voice suddenly emerged. Aren't you forgetting something? Ron, who had been ignored for a long time, raised his hand and said weakly, What about me? From the initial meeting until now, Wood had only glanced at Ron once, when Charlie Weasley was mentioned. There was no helping it. Compared to Sherlock and Harry, his presence was simply too weak. You. Both McGonagall and Wood looked at Ron with puzzled expressions. Being stared at like this, Ron, who had been muttering quietly, immediately couldn't stand it. He immediately protested loudly, I've been playing Quidditch with Charlie since I was little. I want to join the house team too. Hearing Ron's words, Wood immediately became interested. Do you have the same talent as Potter? Ron's face immediately turned as red as his hair. A teenager's blush was the best answer. Though somewhat disappointed, Wood still decided to give Ron a chance. Try flying. All right. Ron nodded vigorously. Given the opportunity, Ron performed very well. One could say he exceeded expectations. He even performed several dangerous maneuvers in the air that he had previously wanted to try but hadn't dared. Even by Wood's critical standards, Ron's level could be called passable, quite good for a first-year student. However, he was still far from excellent enough to join the house team exceptionally like Harry. Wood was straightforward and directly told Ron the answer. Ron immediately became somewhat dejected. Just as Harry was about to offer some words of comfort, Wood suddenly turned to Sherlock. Holmes, what about you? Don't you want to try? Harry. For all. Ron. O+O. Wood hadn't noticed the two boys' expressions, or perhaps wouldn't have cared even if he had. In his opinion, although Sherlock's earlier flight into the air had merely been to demonstrate Harry's talent, that single maneuver had already been quite impressive. If nothing else, he was certainly better than Ron. But he still needed to see more of Sherlock's performance. Unexpectedly, Sherlock declined. "No need. I'm not interested." Having Harry alone on the Quidditch house team was sufficient for gathering information. If he joined as well, that would be a waste of resources. He had other things to spend his time and energy on. Hearing Sherlock say this, Wood felt somewhat regretful. However, what they needed most now was a seeker, and Harry was undoubtedly the only choice for that position. Although Sherlock might also be an excellent player, Gryffindor's need for other positions wasn't as urgent. Having already gained Harry, and with Sherlock himself unwilling, Wood didn't insist further. The urgent matter was to train Harry as quickly as possible. After the three of them left, just as McGonagall was about to say something, Wood asked anxiously, "Professor, when are you planning to go see Headmaster Dumbledore?" McGonagall, Really, enough. Sherlock, you should have agreed to him. Just after leaving the Quidditch pitch, Ron immediately said to Sherlock, "Although I'm grateful that you declined Wood to spare my feelings, such opportunities don't come easily." I think you may have misunderstood." Sherlock turned to look at Ron, saying seriously, "I declined him because I don't have time for training 3 times a week. It has nothing to do with you. In fact, whether or not I join the Gryffindor house team wouldn't change the outcome of your rejection." Ron. Even if that was true, did he really have to say it? Seeing Ron's expression, Harry couldn't help but suggest quietly, "Sherlock, I think, sometimes you don't need to be so blunt." "Dear Harry, I've told you before that in most circumstances I won't lie, unless it's necessary." Actually, I think this is one of those necessary circumstances." No. Lying merely to spare someone's pitiful self-esteem, thereby creating unrealistic fantasies, would be irresponsible to him. Having no talent isn't shameful. Correctly recognizing the gap between oneself and others can significantly improve efficiency. That way, time won't be wasted on obviously unachievable goals. Harry found he couldn't argue with Sherlock. Not only couldn't he argue, but Sherlock had actually convinced him. What he said made so much sense that Harry was left speechless. However, as Ron's friend, he still felt this approach was somewhat cruel. Sherlock was simply too rational. Going on like this, he'd have no friends. Fortunately, Ron's dejection came quickly and left just as fast. When he saw the sumptuous dinner, he immediately threw the matter to the back of his mind. Time to eat. Over the following month, Sherlock remained busy as ever. The vast majority of his time was still spent discussing magic with professors of various subjects that interested him. As mentioned before, understanding and accepting a completely new system and worldview, and making it work for oneself, was not an easy task. Even a genius like Sherlock still needed to continuously invest time. As for the time originally set aside for exploring the Forbidden Forest and the secret room, it was now occupied by other matters. First was his promise to McGonagall not to miss defense against the dark arts classes anymore. Professor Quirrell's classes were truly boring. Describing them as reading directly from textbooks would already be giving him too much credit. Because Professor Binns, the ghost who also liked to read from textbooks in history of magic, could at least answer questions calmly when occasionally someone asked. It was just that his hearing wasn't very good, and he always had to repeat several times things like, "What Gringe, what Grange, Gran what," which was somewhat exasperating. In contrast, when Quirrell was asked questions, he would deflect and speak evasively about the weather. When pressed further, his face would flush red, his eyes would twitch, looking like he'd been severely frightened. It was hard to believe he had once been an outstanding Ravenclaw student. According to insiders, Quirrell had become this way after encountering vampires and witches in the dark forest. But through his observations of Quirrell, Sherlock deduced that what he had encountered in the dark forest was definitely not just these creatures. He must be hiding another secret. Currently, Sherlock wasn't interested in this secret. After all, from his observations during this period, Dumbledore, McGonagall, Snape, Flitwick, Sprout, Hagrid, Filch. Without exaggeration, every one of the school's faculty and staff had secrets. Under such circumstances, unless it involved crime, Sherlock couldn't be bothered to pay attention. The second matter was Harry. Just as Sherlock had predicted before school began, the name Harry Potter meant he would always find himself at the center of events. Even if he did nothing, trouble would come looking for him. In nearly 2 months since school began, he had already encountered numerous incidents, including but not limited to being enthusiastically surrounded by students whose excitement hadn't yet faded, Peeves actively appearing to harass him, getting lost and wandering into the room Dumbledore had expressly forbidden, only to be caught by Filch, moving staircases inexplicably shifting position, and Malfoy actively coming to provoke him, among other behaviors. The previous situations were manageable. As long as Sherlock was there, they could all be resolved smoothly. But Sherlock couldn't be with Harry every moment. The result was that whenever he wasn't around, Harry had to face these problems alone. As for Ron, whether he was there or not made no difference. The last item was pure trouble that came looking for them. After being taught a lesson by Sherlock on the train, Malfoy had indeed been quiet for a while. But living collectively in Slytherin had obviously given him confidence. A month after school began, he started provoking Harry again. However, out of wariness toward Sherlock, knowing that Crabbe and Goyle together were no match for Sherlock, Malfoy naturally didn't want to, nor dare to, directly confront Harry. So, he cleverly chose to change tactics and fight a flanking battle. One morning, Malfoy approached Harry and challenged him to a duel. If it were merely an invitation to battle, there would be no need to fear Sherlock's intervention. Indeed, Sherlock didn't take action. Not only did he not act, but he actually became quite interested in the so-called duel. Because this touched upon his knowledge blind spot. A wizard's duel? It sounded quite interesting. At this crucial moment, Ron jumped forward. He said that he would serve as the second for this duel. Not only that, but in front of a completely bewildered Harry, he arranged with Malfoy to meet at midnight in the trophy room. After Malfoy left, Harry still hadn't recovered. Then, through Ron's long-winded description, Sherlock learned the rules of wizard dueling. He quickly reached a conclusion. So-called wizard dueling is a formal competition with ritual significance that has formed in wizard culture over a long period. Ron thought for a moment and said with some surprise, "That seems to be exactly right. You summarized it so quickly." Just tradition, copying the medieval knight duel system, except limiting both parties to using only magic. Sherlock waved his hand dismissively. Unfortunately, true knightly spirit barely exists in contemporary times, but never mind that. Are you serious about being Harry's second? After all, according to dueling rules, if one of the duelists dies, the second must take their place. Ron. Harry was startled and was about to speak when Ron, noticing his pale face, quickly added, "That's the idea, yes. But you and Malfoy know too little magic to really hurt each other. At most, you could shoot sparks at each other." Only then did Harry breathe a sigh of relief, though he looked at Sherlock with some distress. "But what if I wave my wand and nothing happens at all?" "Then throw away the wand and punch him in the nose." Before Sherlock could respond, Ron had already answered. Harry was stunned, then looked at Sherlock with pleading eyes. "Not a bad suggestion," Sherlock said seriously. "To achieve one's goal, sometimes one indeed shouldn't be constrained by mundane limitations." Receiving Sherlock's support for the first time, Ron suddenly gained confidence and became righteous. "However, if it were me, I wouldn't go today." "Why?" Ron, who had just toughened up, asked in surprise. "Refusing a duel is cowardly behavior." This was so un-Gryffindor. Bravery is stupidity's best substitute. Sherlock said flatly, "Because Malfoy has no intention of going there at all. Dear Harry, I'll bet you a galleon that if you go there, what's most likely waiting for you is Filch." With this statement, Harry's face, which had just returned to normal, turned pale again. "Impossible! Absolutely impossible!" Ron immediately protested. "Although Malfoy is indeed a bastard, he is after all from the Sacred 28. "Shut up, Ron. You're dragging down the entire house's IQ. "Ron. Degree. Just when you mentioned the second, Malfoy chose one from Crabbe and Goyle. If he were really preparing to duel, it couldn't be so hasty, making the decision only when you brought it up. This was obviously just perfunctory stalling, meant to trick you into going to a location he had already determined. Although he tried hard to hide it, if you were observant enough, you could still notice his right leg had a slight limp. He should have been injured during flying practice. I guess you didn't notice that he didn't stay on his broomstick for as long as usual during yesterday's flying lesson." Harry and Ron looked at each other blankly. They indeed hadn't noticed. Damn, was this the difference between seeing and observing again? Also, his reaction to Harry choosing Ron as his second was too calm. If I were Malfoy, seeing Harry choose Ron instead of Sherlock as his second, even if not overjoyed, I would certainly feel relieved. Ron, underscore. But he didn't. Once again ignoring Ron's face full of resentment, Sherlock directly gave his conclusion. He doesn't care who goes with Harry because he never intended to duel at all. As for the so-called sacred 28 pure-blood families, that's just a self-entertaining joke. Sherlock looked disdainful. What era was this? Still playing the bloodline superiority game. It had to be said that, in some aspects, the wizarding world was truly backward. Sherlock's influence on Harry was still considerable. He was ultimately persuaded and didn't go to the duel. Events later proved Sherlock was right. Because the next day, Malfoy didn't mention the duel at all. On the contrary, when he saw Harry and Ron safe and sound, he looked extremely surprised. Seeing this, Ron couldn't help but feel grateful that Harry had listened to Sherlock. He had still been urging Harry to act the night before, but was refused. Naturally, he wouldn't mention this. He seized the opportunity to mock Malfoy mercilessly. With the help of the Weasley twins' publicity, the news that Malfoy had actively invited Harry to a duel but failed to show up quickly spread throughout the school. This left Malfoy unable to hold his head up for a long time. It also deepened the little lion's understanding of Sherlock. Gradually, people began consulting him about difficulties they encountered in daily life. Sherlock basically welcomed all comers. Through these matters, he could further understand the wizarding world. The most frequent visitor was Neville, who shared a dormitory with him. His pet toad named Trevor would go missing constantly. Naturally, Malfoy wouldn't accept such humiliation. As they say, when one plan fails, devise another. He constantly watched Harry, hoping to find a chance to regain face. The opportunity soon came. On a seemingly ordinary morning, when owls flew into the Great Hall as usual, almost everyone's attention was drawn to a long, thin package carried by 6 long-eared owls. Sherlock glanced up once before looking away. Harry, like everyone else, was eager to know what was in the package. Ron was keeping his head down, focused on eating. Just as Harry was about to ask Sherlock, several owls circled down, and the package landed right in front of him, even knocking his bacon to the floor. Harry was amazed. "What is this?" Ron, who had been eating, was also stunned. He was about to open it when he heard Sherlock say, "If I were you, I wouldn't touch it." Ron immediately pulled his hand back. As if to validate Sherlock's words, just as the owls that had delivered the package flapped their wings and flew away, another owl flew in and dropped a letter precisely on top of the package. Harry picked up the letter and was about to tear it open when Ron stopped him. He looked at Sherlock. "Can I open the letter?" Harry was somewhat amused and exasperated. Ron's behavior was typical overcorrection. "Open it. I believe this is Professor McGonagall's gift to you." Upon hearing this, Harry no longer cared how Sherlock had determined this. With trembling hands, he tore open the letter. A few short lines were written inside. "Do not open the package at the table. It contains your new Nimbus 2000, but I don't want everybody knowing you've got a broomstick or they'll all want one. Oliver Wood will meet you tonight on the Quidditch field at 7 o'clock for your first training session. By the way, Mr. Holmes's package is also here. Please remember to give it to him. Sherlock, Professor McGonagall says your package was sent along too." Harry forced himself to contain his excitement and handed the letter to Sherlock and Ron. Sherlock was somewhat surprised. Although he had deduced from the package's shape and weight that this was Professor McGonagall's gift to Harry, he hadn't expected her to send his mail along as well. Nimbus 2000. Ron sighed enviously. "I've never even touched one." "This time you can touch it all you want," Harry said, then turned to Sherlock curiously. "What's in your package?" "A violin sent by my family." Sherlock's voice was calm, but Harry and Ron were directly shocked. "What did you say?" "Sigma, degree, winky face." "You can play the violin too?" Knowledgeable, skilled in boxing and fencing, And now he said he could play violin too? Wasn't this range of skills a bit too broad? Sherlock didn't answer directly but asked instead, "By the way, would you find violin playing too noisy?" Harry was the first to shake his head. No. Having lived with the Dursleys, what noise hadn't he experienced? Just Aunt Petunia's daily banging on the cupboard door was already excessive, not to mention Uncle Vernon's shouting and Dudley's wailing. Ron was somewhat hesitant. That depends on how well it's played. If it's good, it's as beautiful as music, but if it's bad... then there's no problem. Sherlock interrupted him before he could finish. Harry and Ron looked at each other. Was he that confident? The three chatted briefly before quickly leaving, mainly because Harry and Ron wanted to find a quiet place to open the package and have a good look. But after just 2 steps, Sherlock stopped and looked back. "Sherlock, what's wrong?" Harry couldn't help asking. Sherlock looked away. "Nothing, let's go." He had noticed someone following them, but after brief consideration, he ignored it. It was destined to be futile anyway. Ever since the owls had dropped the package, Malfoy had been watching Harry. Like everyone else, he was full of curiosity about that long, thin package. So, when he saw the 3 leaving, he immediately brought Crabbe and Goyle and began tailing them. When the package was opened, Malfoy was practically beside himself with excitement. As everyone knew, first-year students weren't allowed to bring broomsticks. Before school started, he had spent considerable effort trying to secretly bring a broomstick to school, but ultimately failed. Now with such an opportunity, he would never let it pass. In his view, Snape already hated Harry, and with such an opportunity, wouldn't he punish him severely? Expulsion might be unlikely, but detention would definitely be possible. Although Sherlock was indeed very capable, now that they were caught red-handed, no matter how skilled he was, it would be useless. Malfoy never expected that when he found Professor Snape, who usually treated him fairly well, would scold him with a dark face. "Mr. Draco, I advise you to mind your own business." Malfoy was confused. What was going on? Without Sherlock even needing to act, this matter had failed? How could he know that this broomstick was a gift from Professor McGonagall to Harry? Sherlock's words had ultimately had an effect. She didn't want to always be suppressed. Combined with Wood's strong recommendation, Professor McGonagall had finally paid out of her own pocket to purchase the latest model broomstick for Harry, the Nimbus 2000. To be safe, she had informed the other professors in advance, naturally including Snape. So, when Malfoy eagerly came to report, Snape only felt he was being stupid. Malfoy returned defeated, and the confused Crabbe and Goyle hurried over. By this time, Harry and Ron had finished examining the broomstick and violin and were preparing to leave. Naturally, Crabbe and Goyle wanted to stop them. But they were also worried about being beaten up by Sherlock again. Just as their leader Malfoy returned, both their faces immediately showed sinister grins. "Potter, you're finished. However, let them go." "What?" Crabbe and Goyle almost thought they had misheard. Crabbe couldn't help saying, "Draco, he's carrying a broomstick, and it's the latest model Nimbus 2000. Didn't you say before?" "I said let them go," Malfoy roared in a low voice. At this moment, even without Sherlock's explanation, Harry and Ron understood what had happened. Looking at the angry and confused Malfoy, Harry almost laughed out loud. Ron wouldn't miss the opportunity and mocked him mercilessly. "Malfoy, your Comet 260 is decent enough, but it's not in the same league as a Nimbus." Malfoy was submissive when facing Sherlock, but when facing Ron, he struck back hard. "Shut up, Weasley. You can't afford half of that broomstick's handle. I suppose you and your brothers would have to save up twig by twig to buy a complete broomstick, wouldn't you?" "What did you say?" "Say that again if you dare." Sherlock watched them face off and couldn't help shaking his head. Childish. Though thinking about it, this was exactly the mental state 11-year-old boys should have. Compared to them, he was the abnormal one. Just then Hermione arrived, and catching sight of Professor Flitwick in the distance, Sherlock knew this group wouldn't be able to start a real fight. He simply left the others and followed Hermione. To give Hermione flying training. This was the third matter occupying Sherlock's time. It had to be said that Hermione's flying talent exceeded Sherlock's expectations. In this world, some people are naturally poor at certain things. For example, some people aren't good at running. Others struggle with memorization. No matter how hard they try, they can't commit words, sentences, or passages to memory. A few aren't good at reading aloud. Even after reading a text several times, they still stumble and can't read fluently. An even smaller number struggle with comprehension. During class, they feel like they understand everything, but come exam time, they realize they know nothing. Worse still, some simply aren't good at learning at all. For Hermione, this manifested as excelling in all other subjects while completely falling apart in flying class, as if she'd become an entirely different person. Even shortcomings that hadn't shown up in other classes were laid bare in front of Sherlock's eyes. This made Hermione feel even more embarrassed. The more she tried to overcome her difficulties, the more flustered she became. Seeing this situation, Sherlock decided to take matters into his own hands. After teaching Hermione hands-on for several days, he finally achieved passable results. He helped Hermione initially overcome her fear of heights. In truth, everyone has some degree of acrophobia. It's just that some people experience it mildly while others suffer severely. Many people think they don't have a fear of heights simply because they haven't reached their threshold altitude yet. Through analysis and deduction, Sherlock determined that Hermione's acrophobia was a specific phobia that could be resolved with the right treatment. He took Hermione up on a broomstick, gradually increasing altitude until they reached a height that triggered her terror response, staying there for at least half an hour each time. Initially, this kind of close contact made Hermione blush somewhat. But soon, fear overwhelmed all other thoughts. Particularly after reaching a certain altitude, Hermione would tremble all over, her hands and feet turning ice-cold, breaking into a cold sweat even in the dead of winter, tears streaming uncontrollably down her face. The first few times, she even blacked out and fainted completely. If Sherlock hadn't noticed something was wrong and caught her in time, she would have fallen headfirst from the broomstick. After several attempts, even Hermione began to consider giving up. This is too difficult. However, seeing that Sherlock didn't seem bothered by this, in fact, he almost seemed to have an attitude of, "I'd actually be more relaxed if you gave up," she gritted her teeth and persevered. After all, compared to others, Hermione was only willing to have deep conversations with Sherlock. Nearly 2 months into the school year, her relationships with her roommates and classmates weren't particularly harmonious. In fact, Hermione's relationships with her classmates were merely that, classmates, nothing more. She was aware of this herself. After all, the same thing had happened when she attended school in the Muggle world. Most of her classmates thought she was arrogant, liked to show off, and was always lecturing others. As they say, honest advice is hard to accept. In this world, except for people with particular preferences, no one likes being constantly lectured by others. Especially teenagers of this age group. They won't even listen to their parents and elders, let alone their classmates. When she arrived at Hogwarts, this situation hadn't changed. Her classmates all thought Hermione was too focused on school rules and cared too much about house points. Remember, this was Gryffindor. Taking the Weasley twins as an example, the little lions never followed rules. While reckless troublemakers might be a stereotype, it certainly reflected some truth. This had led to several unpleasant conflicts between Hermione and her classmates. This even included Harry and Ron. The incident stemmed from Malfoy challenging Harry to a wizard's duel. Having overheard the conversation, she privately warned the two boys. Her intentions were good, but the execution was problematic. You absolutely cannot wander around the school at night. Think about it, if you're caught, how many points will Gryffindor lose? And you're definitely going to be caught. You're really being selfish. Such words were already quite uncomfortable to hear. What made it worse was what she did next. She waited by the fat lady's portrait at midnight to see if Harry and Ron would actually go night wandering through the school. Of course, Harry had listened to Sherlock's advice and didn't go to meet Malfoy. So, Hermione waited for nothing. Instead, she encountered round-faced Neville, who had forgotten the password and couldn't get in. Hermione brought him back to the common room, which could be considered an inadvertent good deed. The next day, when Harry and Ron learned about this from Neville, they could hardly believe that such a busybody existed in the world. Naturally, their attitude toward her became even worse. Especially when Ron was bragging about Malfoy not daring to show up for the duel, he also mentioned what Hermione had done. This made the first-year Gryffindors even more obviously reject her. Neville was the exception. He was still grateful to Hermione for helping him find Trevor on the train and for bringing him back from outside Gryffindor Tower. In this situation, Hermione naturally felt lonely. Sherlock was the only person besides Neville who didn't reject her. He continued to address her as Hermione, just as before, and didn't stop giving her private lessons. After all, in Sherlock's view, these weren't really problems at all. Out of curiosity, Hermione also asked Sherlock about this. His answer greatly surprised her. "Can't you just ignore them?" Sherlock was genuinely puzzled by Hermione's confusion. "If you think you're right, why should you care about other people's opinions?" He himself had been isolated by classmates when attending school in the Muggle world. This wasn't surprising. After all, his personality and methods weren't naturally likable, always pointing out others' mistakes with precision, never considering the appropriate time or place. But so what? Other people's opinions had absolutely no effect on Sherlock. Some people had actually tried to bully him. For instance, spilling ink on his homework, stuffing beetles in his pencil case, adding ingredients to his breakfast, and so forth. However, all these actions mysteriously returned to the perpetrators themselves. Opening their bags to find books stained with ink and a toad inside, or being overwhelmed by salt during meals to the point of questioning their existence. Some disbelievers, relying on their physical strength, confronted him directly, only to retreat after losing 2 front teeth. Hermione greatly envied Sherlock's ability to treat others as if they didn't exist. She wanted to be like that too, but she simply couldn't manage it. "If you're truly this troubled, I do have a suggestion." Seeing Hermione unable to concentrate due to her distress, Sherlock tried to view the problem from her perspective. "You could stop taking house points so seriously." "How is that possible?" Hermione, who had always held herself to honor student standards, immediately protested. "Professor Snape finds fault and deducts points every day. If we don't follow the school rules as well." "Miss Hermione, your brief 11 years, no, wait, 12 years, of life experience isn't sufficient to support an understanding of reality." "Hermione, reality is this: either continue being yourself and don't care about others' opinions. After all, you're not a pound note, you can't make everyone like you, or change your thinking and try to fit into the environment." Although it sounded unpleasant, Hermione understood that Sherlock had the right to say such things. He was living proof of the former approach. She had witnessed Sherlock's behavior that could only be called appalling on more than one occasion. For instance, telling Ron and round-faced Neville to their faces that, "You're lowering the entire house's intelligence." Or telling Seamus that his mere presence was disrupting his thinking. And just now, emphasizing that she was 12 years old. In Hermione's view, these actions were far worse than anything she had done. She was only upholding school rules, while Sherlock was directly attacking people personally. Yet Sherlock remained completely indifferent, turning a deaf ear to others' pointing and whispering, remaining true to himself from beginning to end. Hermione could only admit defeat. When it came to walking the walk, she couldn't compare. After much consideration, she decided not to follow Sherlock's advice. She would use her own method to change her situation.